about the past 10, I've been involved in this project called the World War II Living History Project. We interview veterans, we preserve their stories, and with the advent of new technology, we're also broadcasting today live on the World Wide Web. These tapes are going to be archived and preserved for future generations so that you and other Americans can appreciate what this generation went through before they pass. So today we're going to talk about the war in the Pacific. We have 3 veterans of that conflict who were in the U.S. Navy. To my left, I have Barney Ross. Want to give a wave, Barney?
Oh, yes.
Barney.
My real name is Gerald.
Gerald
Everybody
Ross.
in Whitehall has a nickname.
From Whitehall, I have Eugene Fellers from Greenwich, and I have Judge John Leary from Hudson Falls. They're the guests of honor today, and we're going to tell their story. To my right, I have several of their comrades. These are all combat Marines. I have almost a whole battalion with me today, so watch your step. We interviewed them last year, and they're here, of course, to support U.S. Navy. During the war, it was the other way around. We have Walt Hammer right here to my right. James Butterfield, who was at Okinawa. James lost his eyesight 56 years ago at Okinawa. I have Dan Lawler, who was at Peleliu in Okinawa. And I have Mr. Art Lepore, who was at Iwo Jima, wounded. And I have Mr. Robert Addison over here. He was with us last year. He was one of the legendary Addison's Raiders, who were the first actual combat Marines to engage Japanese forces in the Pacific in 1942 at Guadalcanal. Okay, I'm going to begin today. Today our theme is going to be the war in the Pacific, as I said. It's kind of appropriate because there's a new movie coming out. Perhaps you've seen the cover of Newsweek, or you've seen the trailers for the film Pearl Harbor. In it, there's an article by Tom Brokaw, the news anchor for NBC, and he's also the author of several books that go by the title The Greatest Generation, which of course refers to these gentlemen and the men and women who basically saved the world 50, 60 years ago. So I'm going to read a little bit from his article to begin. Jessica Sherlock, one of my students, is going to guide us through Pearl Harbor, and then we'll ask these gentlemen where they were when they heard the news that the United States was at war with Japan. Okay, this article is called A Generation's Trial by Fire, and it's not that long. I'm not going to read the whole thing, so bear with me. It's hard to imagine a single event that had a greater instant effect on the collective behavior of an American generation than the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. When the news came, many were at home by the radio or on a Sunday drive, at football games or in movie theaters. We were just emerging from a Great Depression and trying to keep our distance from the wars in Europe and the military ambitions of an imperialistic Japan. Then came the electrifying radio dispatches and word-of-mouth reports that the Japs, as they were called, had bombed Pearl Harbor. Overnight, isolationists became converts to intervention, stirred in part by an eloquent call to service from Franklin Roosevelt, and in part by a great tidal wave of gung-ho patriotism that swept across the land. Pearl Harbor had enraged and unified a country, committing the United States towards a common goal. Pearl Harbor was a rite of passage for those I have called the greatest generation. Great, but not perfect. Some Americans dodged the draft or pulled strings to get cushy assignments. Black Americans in uniform had to fight to get into combat. Most of them were assigned as hospital orderlies or as kitchen stewards. In the business world, war profiteers cashed in. But by and large, America responded magnificently to its greatest challenge since the American Civil War. The Japanese, who had thought their attack would eventually force the United States to sue for peace, had monumentally miscalculated. Within months, the United States had been converted from a peaceful, almost pacifist nation into a warrior state, whose national purpose was to fight the Japanese and Germans to an unconditional surrender. Everyone understood the terms, and to a remarkable degree, almost everyone participated in the war effort. Marriage plans were accelerated. Brothers and buddies rushed to enlist in the same service. College kids arranged to graduate early. So many members of that generation have said the same thing to me. The day they heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor, they knew that the world had changed. They just didn't realize how much. Young men and women traded in their days of innocence for years of separation, sacrifice, and loss. In the early going, when the daily news was bleak and the outcome was uncertain, a small chorus of critics grew bolder. But the Americans' will held firm, fortified by the carefully screened news and reports from the front and the relentlessly upbeat tone of the Commander-in-Chief, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There were restrictions and there were rationing, but the rationing system was a constant reminder that the greater sacrifices were being made elsewhere. There were other reminders. Picture a neighborhood of modest family homes, many of which had gold stars hanging in the front window. Those were the homes of mothers who had lost a son in the war, and there were plenty of them from Hudson Falls, New York. I would like to think that America would have gotten involved in the war without the attack on Pearl Harbor. The threat to our own security and all we believe in was simply too great to ignore forever, despite the reservations of those who believed that we could be a self-contained fortress. The despicable behavior of the Japanese one Sunday morning in 1941 ended the argument and forced a new American generation that, in my judgment, will always have a place in the bold print of the history of the world. And I think most Americans will concur with that. Okay, now we're going to watch a PowerPoint presentation by Jessica Sherlock. She's going to click, and I'm going to read for you. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. The master plan. Japan devised a master plan that would allow her to take control of Southeast Asia and the West Pacific. This required the removal of Western influence in that area. The area was known as the, quote, Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere because the Japanese told these native peoples living in East Asia, China, Southeast Asia, etc., that it would be better for them to be ruled by Asians than by the whites who previously had ruled them. But as it turned out, they turned them into slave laborers. Expansion. Summer of 1937. Japan won the Sino-Japanese War and now occupied most of East China. June 1940, Japan took northern Indochina, Southeast Asia. Plans initiate. September 1940, Japan signs the Tripartite Act with Germany and Italy, illustrates her dislike of the United States. January 41, Admiral Yamamoto, the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese fleet, initiates serious investigation for a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which was where the U.S. Pacific Fleet was based. The United States takes action. Midsummer 1941, Japan takes all of Indochina. FDR curbs further advances in Asia by putting together a total embargo on Japan and freezing all of her assets in the United States. Japan continues plan. March 41, Commander Genda completes first draft of the Pearl Harbor attack. April 10th, Batai, the Japanese air fleet, is established by the Japanese Imperial Navy, commanded by Vice Admiral Nagumo, pictured here. Plan approved. And here we see a layout of the harbor. October 18th, Japanese General Staff accepts Yamamoto's plan to attack Pearl Harbor. November 5th, Yamamoto issues Operation Order Number 1, establishes 12/4/41 as day of attack. Next slide. A day that will live in infamy. Who said that? It was Roosevelt. When did he say it? On December 8th. And what was he doing in that speech? He was declaring war, wasn't he? Oh yeah, we were in it. 7:55 a.m., attack begins. At 8:10, the United States ship Arizona explodes, and it's to the left, and it's one of the most horrifying photographs from American point of view of all World War II. Next slide. Or next. Arizona takes 1,177 lives with her, and don't forget that there were 34 pairs of brothers aboard that ship. There was also one father and one son. And don't forget that capsized immediately. It went over, and it was impossible to get the men out, the men who were below deck at the time. They could hear tapping for weeks from the inside of the ship. There was no way to save the men. There was a calendar found in the bridge, which would have been the top part of the ship later on, and 3 men in there had survived, and they marked off the days. December 24th was the last day marked on that calendar. Today, there's a memorial over it because the men who were in that ship were incinerated. Their bodies couldn't be removed. That's where they lie today. And you can still see the oil bubbling up from the USS Arizona. The attack ended after the second strike at 9:45 in the morning. The damage had been done. Over 200 planes and over 2,000 people were killed, including civilians, 2,300 or so. And on the next day, we got into the war. Can you back up to the... Go back to the slide that shows the plan view of the ships in the harbor, the map. You know, I'm going to start by asking the 3 gentlemen to the left. I could ask everyone in this room who's old enough. But I'll ask the 3 gentlemen to the left who were in the U.S. Navy to just briefly tell us where they were and what they were doing when they heard that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor and how they fell. And I'll start with Gene in the middle. You.
I was at the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, Florida. I had enlisted January 3rd of 1941, so that put me in the Navy about 11 months before Pearl Harbor. And I went to radio school down there and was assigned to the transmitter station after graduation from that school. And I remember one of the chief petty officers, an old timer to us young men, who said, "Just you wait, we're going to level Tokyo right to the ground." He made it sound as if that was going to happen immediately. It happened, but it took a number of years to happen.
Let's go to John.
Yeah.
You say Barney for last because he was there, of course.
Very brief. I was
Speak right into it if you can. Put it. Yep. There you go.
okay.
That's good.
I was in early, and I had received my commission in my wings, and I was on my first leave. And they hit Pearl Harbor, and I was immediately called back, and that's the one thing I personally never forgave them for, spoiling my first leave.
You were home for what, 3 days when you heard the news?
I was home about 3 days.
And that was that was here in Hudson Falls, you were home, or?
No, well, I'd come home to visit my father and mother first, and then I went out to Syracuse. I was engaged to a girl there, and was later became we were married. And we'd gone to a movie. Came home from the movie, and I was staying in the same place I did when I was in law school, and the lady who ran it, when I walked in the door, started crying. I thought something had happened to folks at home. But turned out she said they bombed Pearl Harbor. Well, I was so relieved that my mother was all right. And I wasn't too sure where Pearl Harbor was, or who she was at that time. All I knew was that I had a telegram telling me to return immediately.
And it was time to go back to base.
It wasn't really on my time, but it was on theirs.
All right. Barney? Barney, where were you on December 7th, 1941? At 7:55 in the morning, Barney.
He says, "Who's that?" I was standing on the deck of the USS Blue, a destroyer. And that's where she was right there. And this is what she looks like here. And I had got up early that morning, and I was getting ready to go to church services. And we were all alone out there at this buoy, tied up. and I was waiting for a motor launch to pick me up and take me to a larger ship where they had a chaplain. Destroyers didn't have chaplains because they were too small. So I'm talking with this shipmate of mine waiting for the motor launch, and all at once I saw this plane go by our ship, and I didn't know what it was, but the fellow with me said, "That's a Jap plane," and she went down and she dropped the torpedo, and I saw the USS Utah turn over. So we had when we were in Pearl like that, to get out of the sun, we always had awnings back over the back end of the ship, or the stern of the ship, I should say.
That's the Utah right here.
Yep.
This is Barney's ship, the blue.
Yep.
USS Arizona we were just talking about
Yep.
is over in this vicinity with the West Virginia, another ship that was hit critically. Go ahead, Barney.
Yeah. So I didn't know really what to do. The searchlight was my battle station, but there was no need for being on a searchlight at 7:55 in the morning. So, and not only that, but 2/3 of the crew was allowed to go ashore for their weekend. They had weekend passes. So the only ones aboard were those that had the duty, and so I started to help with the awning, get it down, and as I was doing that, the chief gunner's mate came up, and he started breaking the locks on the ammunition, because everything was locked up, for fear that somebody might go in there with a cigarette or something. So he said to me, Ross, follow me. So he took me down into number 3 magazine, and he said, I want you to take powder and shells and send it up to the gun. And he showed me how to operate the hoist. So that's what I did. I'd get a shell. The shells weighed about 80 pounds, I think. When I was 19 or 20 years old, that was nothing. I could pick one of those up. But so that's what I did. I'd take a shell, and then I'd take a bag of powder, and I'd put it in the hoist, and I'd send it up to the gun. In the meantime, we're getting underway. So all we had aboard that ship that morning was 1 Annapolis graduate and 3 reserve ensigns. That's all we had. All the top officers were ashore. So we managed to get underway, and I don't know till this day why we didn't get strafed or take a torpedo, but we didn't. So we got outside of the exit of the harbor, and we started dropping depth charges. There was Japanese submarines out there, and we got credit for 2 of them, and we got credit for knocking down 4 planes on the way out. So while we were doing all this, there was the USS Phoenix and the St. Louis and 4 or 5 destroyers, and our duty was to try to find the Japanese fleet. So we formed up and tried to find the Japanese fleet, but we never found them, and I'm awfully glad we didn't, because they went in there with 6 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 or 15 cruisers, and about 20 destroyers. The planes alone would have taken care of us, so I was thankful that we never found them. We were out there 36 hours without finding them, and then when we came back into Pearl, it was pitch dark, and we could see the fires burning in the harbor. So that was the end of that day.
What did you see burning specifically? Didn't they have a blackout? When you came in?
Yes, they did. Everything was black in the harbor. But there were still some fires that were still burning on the ships.
The Arizona and the
Yes,
Utah.
sir. Yeah, the Arizona and West Virginia, you know, the California, the Tennessee, the Maryland, those ships that got hit. They didn't get all the fires out.
So they were still burning.
Some of them were still burning. USS Pennsylvania was in dry dock, and there's two destroyers with her, the Castle and the Down, and so, and there were planes on Ford Island also that were, you know, that were burning.
So they made 2 passes, and of course they took everybody totally by surprise.
Yeah.
The Americans fought back, but you were telling me on the phone that one thing that the Japanese didn't get, obviously, were the carriers, because the carriers were out to sea.
Right. We were very fortunate that the carriers weren't in the harbor.
How many did we have? Sorry to
Well,
interrupt.
I think we had 3 at that time. I think we had the Enterprise, Yorktown, and the Lexington. But anyway, that was a big plus for us. And not only that, they neglected to get our oil supplies, and they neglected to get our submarines. So that was and the battleship was getting to be obsolete anyway. You know, they were cumbersome, and it took carriers with airplanes really to do a good job. You know, and about 3 weeks later, we got orders to strike the Marshall and Gilbert, and we had a task force, and we were with the USS Enterprise, and we had no battleships with us. We had 2 or 3 cruisers, and we probably had 8 or 10 destroyers. So we hit the Marshall and Gilbert Islands about 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was the planes that did the damage. We let the planes off about 4 o'clock in the morning, and they went in and hit the islands. And I imagine the Japanese were a little surprised that we hit back so quick, you know, because they figured, you know, they had us crippled. And about 3 weeks after that, we got orders to go to Wake Island. And we did the same thing. And we went with the Enterprise, and the same task force, the cruisers and the destroyers. And now these trips took about 2 months. They took about a month going and a month coming back. You get on a destroyer for a month, and you know you've been someplace.
How many men were on your
I had
destroyer?
the Blue had about all the destroyers at that time had about 200 men, about 200 men, and a destroyer is rough riding. I mean, you know, they don't, and the sea can be an enemy too, you know, with the rough weather. So by the time we got to hit these islands, and by the time we got back, it was about, each trip took 2 months. And I got some breaks after a while. When we come back from Wake, they sent me to school for 5 weeks. So that was a break. So when I came back into Pearl, I went to school in San Diego. And when I came back into Pearl on a transport, the Blue was going out. And that trip there is when she got hit in the Battle of Sable Island off Guadalcanal. She was hit with a Japanese torpedo. So that was a break for Barnum.
So that was 42?
That was in 42, right.
August 9th.
Yeah,
August 9th.
August 9th. So then, while I was in the receiving ship in Pearl Harbor waiting for the Blue to come back, and she wasn't coming back, so then I was put on the USS Dixie, a repair tender. And then we went and followed the fleet and made repairs, whatever repairs they needed, the ships needed. We had it on this ship. It had electrical shops. We could rewind motors. It had carpenter shops. It had foundries. It had dental shops. It was a big ship. So if you know that's what a tender did. It took care of you know, it took care of the ships that got hit or needed repairs. So I was on her until I got to Guadalcanal. And when I got to Guadalcanal, I had been out there long enough, and I hadn't seen my family in 4 years. So a lot of guys were going back to the States. So I went to the chaplain and I said, look, I haven't seen my family in 4 years. And I said, there's a lot of people going back, you know, that got on this ship after I did. So he said, I'll check your records.
How old were you then, Barney?
I was 22 years old.
So how old were you at Pearl?
I was 20 years old. 20 years old at Pearl Harbor. And I was in the Navy about 1 year and 4 months before Pearl Harbor.
Before the war.
Before the war. So, and
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt.
that's all right. Go
I
ahead.
had a question, and I think some other students might be wondering too. You said you had a lucky break because the blue
Well,
sunk.
it was lucky for me. It wasn't lucky for the 9 people that got killed and the 20 that were injured.
Did the ship actually go down, saying?
Well, what happened was she took a torpedo in the stern, and they couldn't. She wouldn't run. So the USS Henley, which was one of the other destroyers, tried to tow her. This is in Iron Bottom Bay, and while the Henley was trying to tow her, they got word that the Japanese planes were coming back in. So we sunk her ourselves. We took 5-inch shells and sunk her.
Why'd you sink your own ship?
Well, so the Japanese wouldn't get it. We didn't want the Japanese to get it, you know, intact. So we sunk it. Yeah, and so then I later on, after I went back to the States, I went to San Francisco to get my orders. I went to San Francisco to get my leave. They were going to give me 30 days leave, and they took 10 days away from that for traveling time. So I came back from San Francisco to Whitehall by train. And then when my 20 days was up, I went back to San Francisco. And when I got back to San Francisco, I went up to get my orders, and the guy says to me, USS Chicago, Philadelphia Navy Yard. Here I just came from the East Coast. But this is a picture of the Chicago. She's a heavy cruiser with 8-inch guns. And she had 40s and 20s on her. And after she was commissioned, we went down through the Panama Canal and back. And by this time, Iwo Jima and Okinawa and them were over. Our job was to bombard the coast of Japan and support airstrikes. And while we were doing that, they dropped both atomic bombs. And after the atomic bombs were dropped, the war ended. And we went into Tokyo Bay with the rest of the fleet, the Missouri and the rest of them, while they signed the peace treaty.
I want to ask you some more about how you felt, how everybody here felt, who was there, who was alive at the time, about the Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb against the Japanese. But can't do it right now because we have to pause for station identification. This is the World War II Living History Project, and we're going to take a 8 to 10 minute intermission. Let people get air. There's going to be class changes. People are going to be back. We're live in the Hudson Falls High School library. I will reintroduce our guest today. I left a very important gentleman out the first time around, Mr. Charlie Jones. He is that important. Mr. John Leary. Mr. Gene Fellers, Mr. Barney Ross, U.S. Navy. To my right, I have Mr. Walt Hammer, Mr. James Butterfield, Mr. Danny Lawler, Mr. Art Laporte, and Mr. Robert Addison. Okay, we're going to continue our story of the U.S. Navy and the wars in the Pacific. These gentlemen were, of course, our Navy men, and to my right are the Marines that they supported. About 6 months after Pearl Harbor, it was pretty clear that the Japanese seemed to think that they had the upper hand in the Pacific. However, at the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, it was the first time in history that two sides that had aircraft carriers clashed. It was the first real carrier battle. At this battle, we lost a ship, the USS Lexington carrier, and we had the USS Yorktown, which was severely damaged. USS Yorktown had to speed back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. And there's a map behind me on the wall, which I just put up. I'll show you where Midway is. Here's Pearl Harbor. Our cameras are focusing in, so if you can't see back there, look at the computer screen. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Empire, 1942. Midway. And now we're going to have a PowerPoint presentation on that particular battle because it's considered to be the turning point in the Pacific. The United States went on the offensive after this, and the Imperial Navy was checked. Okay, go ahead, Jess. Battle Midway, June 1942. Yamamoto's plan was to lure out and destroy the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet attacked 6 months earlier at Pearl Harbor. The largest flotilla ever assembled in the Pacific cruised toward the westernmost U.S. outpost at Midway. Japanese forces outnumber American by 4-1. Left-hand column, Japanese. We have 4 large aircraft carriers, 2 light carriers, according to Time Life history of World War II. 7 battleships the Japanese had, 280 warplanes on those aircraft carriers. They had 42 destroyers, 14 cruisers, and 15 submarines that were going to set up a picket between Midway and Pearl Harbor to try and stop any of the U.S. fleet that might come to Midway's rescue. There were also more than 30 support ships carrying 5,000 Japanese troops for the invasion of the tiny island. U.S. forces, we had 3 aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the battle-damaged Yorktown, which was undergoing hasty repairs at Pearl Harbor after the late May battle at Coral Sea. This is early June. Carriers had no battleships, really, of any use to protect them. There were 234 carrier-based fighter planes and small bombers, and one of our members, Mr. John Leary, was a torpedo bomber pilot during that battle. He was on the USS Yorktown. Other planes were also based at Midway, most of the latter pilots never having flown in combat before. There were 16 destroyers, 8 cruisers, so you can see we were heavily outnumbered, but we did have one advantage. Next slide. Here's a terrible graphic to show you the lopsided scorecard, so to speak. I'm going to step away from the microphone. You see the imperial sun, the rising sun of the Japanese flag. These are their forces. They're going to strike not only Midway, but also the Aleutian Islands, which were part of Alaska, United States territory, and try and lure the remnants of the Pacific Fleet out to Midway and devastate them. You can see by the graphics that we were heavily outnumbered. Next slide. Japanese intelligence had placed the Hornet and the Enterprise 1,000 miles away in the southwest, and the Yorktown is having been sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea about a week and a half before. They were wrong. American code breakers had intercepted the Japanese plane and hoped to use this information to turn the tables on the Japanese. The element of surprise was crucial, and you see Midway Islands right here. Not a large base at all. This is the Japanese carrier Soryu, one of several, steaming towards Midway. And the Japanese carrier Hiryu. June 4th, 1942, 4:30 in the morning, Japanese carriers launch 180 warplanes towards Midway. At 7:08 a.m., U.S. flyers from Midway, the island base, began to attack the Japanese fleet. They sustained heavy losses and scored no hits. It wasn't from lack of trying. 10:22 to 10:28, within a span of about 6 minutes, torpedo dive bombers from United States carriers scored direct hits on the Japanese carriers Kaga, Agagi, and Soryu. And here we see a group of them getting ready to launch off the Enterprise. And I believe that most of those planes didn't come back. Next slide. This, I believe, is a shot of the U.S. torpedo bombers that were used at the battle, the Avengers. Here's a shot of the T-3 returning to the Yorktown. Shot up pretty good. Next slide. These are paintings, of course. 12 noon, June 4th. Yorktown is hit by 3 bombs and 2 aerial torpedoes. The ship was abandoned. 5:01 p.m., 5 hours later, the Yorktown flyers joined the Enterprise in their attack on the Hiryu, setting it ablaze. And on June 6, at 1:31, a Japanese sub torpedoed the Yorktown, which sank the next morning. Next slide. And here you see the Yorktown. It's listing here. Here's a picture of it when it's not been attacked, but it's listing in the sea. You can see that. Now, if you turn your head sideways, I couldn't figure out how to get this graphic to turn. This is an artist's interpretation of the USS Yorktown as it lies several miles beneath the Pacific today. This was discovered a few years ago by an underwater archaeologist named Bob Ballard, and they went down and they found it. And that's it. That's the ship, intact. Turning point. Japanese losses by the end of the day. 4 carriers gone, which was basically most of them. 1 cruiser. They lost 322 planes. They lost 3,500 men. United States losses, the USS Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 150 planes, and the lives of 307 men. The Japanese would never again launch such a major offensive. The Americans had avenged Pearl Harbor. This was a quote from a Japanese official at the time. Tide had turned. One gentleman who was with us today is Mr. John Leary. And John, can you tell us what your role was at that battle? You said you were on the Yorktown, am I right? Right. And what was your job, John?
Trying to stay alive.
Trying to stay alive was his job.
Well, chart along with
Could I have you speak closer to the microphone?
Okay.
That's beautiful.
There were only 6 TBF torpedo planes involved. They were based on the island. Only 1 of them returned. And on that one, both crewmen were dead. That was the only TBFs they had. They had old torpedo planes, TBDs. And their top speed was only about 100 miles an hour. They were doing well. So they were no match for the Japanese. They launched 57. They had 3 back.
Is this from the base at Midway?
No.
It's from...
They lost
They
a lot
lost
of dive bombers. But,
You talking about the Enterprise?
The carriers,
Yeah.
all together. And that's all they had at the end of the day. Hornet, they launched, most people have heard of it, Torpedo Squadron 8, Johnny Walton. And they only had 1 left. And
One left out of how many?
He didn't get back. I think they launched close to 40, and they were gone. George Gay was the only one he was picked up. He had a ringside seat at the battle. He was in a life raft, and he was hanging on to one. But George, pardon me, George was the only survivor.
He was a pilot, and everyone else in the squadron was killed.
Everybody.
And he survived the battle. He was shot down. He stayed alive in a life raft, and he watched the battle raging around him.
as you said, it was a turning point of the thing. We'd been at Coral Sea, and that was kind of a standoff. We lost Lexington. Yorktown was badly damaged. But anyway, the Japanese turned back and did not continue to invade New Guinea or Australia. Later, at Midway, when we arrived back at Pearl Harbor, we thought we were going home because Yorktown was badly damaged. But Admiral Nimitz had other ideas, and he outranked most of us. So they put on civilian workers. And when Yorktown sailed within the 72 hours, there were still quite a few civilians. They never mentioned that during the war, that were lost.
So just to back up, the Battle of Coral Sea, Yorktown, which you were on, makes way to Pearl Harbor for repairs and has to put to sea 72 hours after they arrive in Pearl Harbor to head out to support Midway.
Right.
There were civilians on board from Hawaii
There
who
were
were
still
working
some,
on the ship.
still some civilian workers. Now, Yorktown was hit, and they did abandon ship, but she still stayed afloat and looked like they could make it. So about 200 men went back aboard. And unfortunately, they were on it when they took it down with a submarine. But the battle was won, principally, I think, through their intelligence, because they outmaneuvered and outsmarted the Japanese. From the island of Midway, the Marines were flying dive bombers that were designated with a different designation than the SBD, and they were, well, from the cockpit back, they were canvas. So, you know, they were a bit out of date. They had no diving flaps, and they would dive beautifully, but there was no guarantee they'd come back up. They lost most of those. The Marines also had rooster fighters, rooster buffaloes they called them. I think they had 20-some. They lost all of those. They were just no comparison with the Japanese Zero. But with the help of God, the battle was won by the American carrier pilots. Well, we on Yorktown went over and landed on Enterprise, some on Hornet. So we were like no home of our own. So we wound up a little later on Guadalcanal, shortly, not too long after the Marines landed, and they got Henderson Field open. And with one very short leave, we went from Guadalcanal. I'm sure these gentlemen would know. The 1st Marines were at Guadalcanal, and 4th were at the north end on Bougainville, and we wound up on Bougainville. So we toured the Solomon Islands, all of them. And that cut the Japanese off because it destroyed their largest base at Naval Harbor on New Britain.
What happened at Rouen?
Naval had 5 Japanese airfields, a great harbor, but we could hit it from Bougainville, and did. I was showing this gentleman a clipping. We had well, it turned out to be a rather good day in some respects.
Can I see that clipping?
And now, you don't take my word for it.
Oh, I believe you. I want to read it.
Doesn't it tell you that, Charlie, you believe it?
No, I don't think he took your word, Judge.
He took the judgeship really quick. Yeah, the correspondent that wrote this article, he was, on this gentleman, he was correspondent with the Chicago Tribune. 2 things. Number 1, he reduced me from lieutenant commander to lieutenant general grade. And then he wrote the article with a spirit of he was writing about a party somewhere, like we just had one hell of a good time. But anyway, I took more fellows in with me than I brought home, of course.
I'm going to read the article. Lieutenant, junior grade.
Knock it off.
Lieutenant Commander
Yeah.
John A. Leary. Hudson Falls was one of a group of former college athletes whose teamwork helped to knock out 12 Jap ships in last Thursday's attack at Rabaul Harbor, the Navy disclosed today. The title of this article is Ex-Athletes Team Up to Sink 12 Ships. The official count issued at a South Pacific Air Base said Leary, a coxswain of the 1941 Syracuse University crew, dropped a 2,000-pound bomb with great accuracy on a Jap cargo ship. He made the run over the ship at masthead height, braving heavy anti-aircraft fire from the vessel. In the same attack, Lieutenant, junior grade, Robert L. Reagan, 1941 catcher for the Harvard baseball team, demolished a Jap vessel with a torpedo bomb, and Lieutenant junior grade Bruce Bishop, Star University of Tennessee quarterback, blew up an enemy patrol. How old were you then?
About 23 or 4.
And this was around 1944?
Late 1940. Yes, it was 44 because that's when they went into Bougainville on November 1st.
November 1st. And what was the importance of taking this particular harbor?
Well, we never took the harbor.
No, we did?
No, they never invaded. It was the principal Jap base. They say they had 5 airfields defending it. They had 250 Jap fighters there,
Wow.
which could make it interesting.
Here's another one. Hudson Falls man is aboard plane bombing Japanese cargo ship. The young man who at one time set the tempo as coxswain for the Syracuse University crew a short time ago flew through a curtain of anti-aircraft machine gun fire to drop a 2,000-pound bomb on a Japanese cargo ship at Rabaul Harbor. He is Lieutenant Commander John A. Leary, 24, of Wright Street, this village, a U.S. Navy torpedo bomber pilot. A section leader in the hard-hitting squadron, Lieutenant Leary flew in at masthead level to skip bomb the enemy ship. Now, how high were you above the ship? What's masthead level? How many feet is that?
Oh, I can't remember. I was probably up about 55 feet,
So
70 feet.
they could look up and see you if they wanted to. And they were firing at you pretty heavily.
Yes, they were. And as I've told this gentleman over here, that it's rather difficult to fly when you have a rosary in each hand. But it was effective anyway. I took more fellows in that morning than I brought home. So the score wasn't 12 to nothing.
No?
But those ships were reported in by one of our submarines, and they could not do anything about it because they were just finishing patrol and they were out of torpedoes. They followed these people with their naval escort into Rabaul Harbor and passed the word back to Pearl, and they in turn got contact with what they called Air Sal, commander of the Air Sal. We were called in then, because we were the old outfit there, and we briefed and we sent out somewhere around midnight, and we hit them about dawn. And we lost quite a few people. But the planes that the particular one I had was a troop transport. We were packed, we hadn't unloaded yet. And there were bodies as high as I was. And parts of bodies. So it had to do something to slow them up.
Yeah, well, it seems so. Now, you were flying out of Bougainville then?
Out of Bougainville.
Did you ever, after you landed back on the Enterprise, going back to Midway a little bit, were you a carrier-based pilot anymore?
Yes.
What other,
A couple of small ones you never heard of, the Altamaha, the Kopi. They were trying them out a bit. And we went, in one experience, we went up into, going back toward the Coral Sea, and we had the old Saratoga
the USS Saratoga?
and 2 of these small carriers. And one of of our admirals came aboard. He always wore a red cap. Well, my carrier had the duty that day, that is anti-sub duty. So the big TBS that had 4 large depth charges with all the sonic buoys and all that. And the sea on that day was as smooth as this table. And they only made about 17 knots on a good day. So the captain of the ship, the air officer, and our air group commander recommended catapulting the ship.
What's that mean?
Just that, put on a catapult and shot off. But the admiral said, no, suppose the catapults are damaged, he'd like to see how they, geez, nobody wanted to do it. Well, anyway, the first 3 planes off, which never made it, just went in the water, and one of them blew up. Depth charges weren't set properly. And the last one off was flown by a very good friend of mine, a fellow named Giblin. He was older than most of us. He'd been a professor at the University of Minnesota. Well, Bob made it. He sunk below the valve. They eventually pulled up, flew the patrol. And when he got back, of course, the air group commander, the captain of the ship with him, wanted to shoot the admiral. So Giblin was called to the deck, up to the captain's deck, and the admiral was going to question him. Now this is a 3-star admiral talking to a young lieutenant. Giblin didn't blink an eye. He asked him, what did you do that those other 3 failed to do? Giblin, looking at this admiral, said, I think when they tried to climb, they pulled back on the stick. That's the only way I ever heard of trying to climb, pull back. So the admiral said, well, what did you do? Giblin said, I just took the stick and held it up off the water. Normally, he would have been shot right there. The admiral didn't say a damn word to him because he was in a bad bind. But Giblin had the nerve to crazy, so he just took it and held it off the water. So our people were thrilled with it.
So sometimes you had to battle other people besides the Japanese.
Oh, yes,
obviously.
yeah. Well, the small carriers proved their worth later on.
Now you were telling me on the telephone that you met, or you do the leading ace of World War II, Joe Foss, the Marine pilot.
Joe and I were in, and Marion Carl, I'm sure these gentlemen have heard of Marion Carl. We're in the same flight class. And we've been friendly over the years. And Marion Carl, as you people probably know, is Major General. And was in charge of all investigations for the Marine Corps. And then retired. And he was murdered about a year ago. Someone broke into their home trying to rob it and attack his wife, and he tried to defend her, and he was killed.
Do you students hear that back there?
Kind of.
Okay. Marion Carl, he's talking about a Marine fighter pilot. He had 18.5 credited kills against Japanese pilots. 18.5 is because another pilot may have claimed one of the planes. He was at Guadalcanal, as was Joe Foss. Joe Foss got 26. Within a span of 12 days, he shot down, I don't remember how many, but it was over 10. These are Navy pilots, excuse me, they're Marine pilots that Mr. Larry knew. And the last point he's trying to make is this man retired, a Marine general, and someone broke into his house last year, 1998 actually. He was 83 years old, and he was murdered by an intruder.
Yeah, he was.
Sad day. But he was an American hero, and John got to know him a little bit.
Well, we were all went through the same flight class. No, the Marine and Navy pilots are all the same flight school. Then some guys left the Corps and others Navy. But they've all been through the same training.
And Joe Foss went on to become governor of South Dakota, as well as the one of the early presidents of the American Football League. And you knew him, didn't you? You said you knew him? Joe Foss?
Oh, very well. Joe sent me what he wrote. Wrote a story, his own autobiography. He sent me a copy and I could hardly make out his signal. So I called him. And as it turned out, he had been in a little accident before that and had broken an arm, and he was still trying to write with a broken arm. So I said, after all, I didn't feel too bad. I thought it was pretty good for an Indian. And Joe was let me know that no, he'd broken his arm. Joe was part Sioux. He was first president of the AFL.
Right.
And then governor of South Dakota.
So where did you wind up? When did you get out of the service?
Well, when I came back, finally, I went to test school, and I was on a couple of projects. I was chief gunnery test on when they were flying the Banshee, one of the first jets. And went up for a gunnery shot one morning. And they had 420 millimeters firing with at the nose, of course the jet engines in the back, in the rear. And I just started to pull the trigger. I did pull the trigger, and one of the 20s jumped them out. Wasn't set right. It blew the nose up. And it was hard to tell who was screaming the loudest, the Banshee or myself.
Were you in the air at the time?
Yeah, there's only one pilot. But it got down and landed all right. And they were very kind to me. The next morning they had a ceremony. I still have her medal, though it's bigger than this. And there's a lot of things I couldn't repeat here, but one of them was enemy planes destroyed none, ours one. And they had some other things that I'm sure would have been very familiar to the Corps.
What was the highest rank?
What was your highest rank? Art wants to know.
Commander.
Remember?
No, and when I got out, I finished not quite a year of law school finished. I finished that. And then being an Irish Catholic kid of my generation, we only had three choices. You either became a priest, a fireman, or a cop. So I went in the FBI.
Were you anywhere near Japan when Japan surrendered?
No. No.
Now, were you ever shot down yourself?
By myself?
No, not by.
Well, I had an aptitude for it, as I just explained.
You're right.
Oh, I was banged up somewhere. I don't.
You always made it back.
No, but I had two young fellas that were with me for a long time, lost them both.
Two of your friends?
My gunner was 18 years old. Yeah, he was 17 on his birthday, and it was the day he died. So obviously he lied his age to get in. And, I don't know, a couple of bad days.
Well, I'm sure I have 17-year-olds who are sitting here right now listening to your story. I'm sure they can't imagine what it was like. Nobody can if they weren't there. But I hope they're paying attention because they need to listen to this story. 17-year-olds going away from home, crying for the mothers when they're all shot up, and never seeing home again. Okay, this is what all these gentlemen had to deal with. They all had to live with it. And I'm talking to these men now.
This young fellow was from Oklahoma. But there was a young lad from here, Randy Holmes.
Randy Holmes.
He was 17, hounded his parents to get in. And he went through apprentice seaman training. Was ordered to the Oklahoma, and he was aboard about what, Charlie, about 2 weeks with him.
About that, he went in January.
Yeah, but I mean, he hit Pearl Harbor just
Yeah,
a couple
Pearl
of
Harbor.
few days before. He was on the Oklahoma when it capsized.
He was on the USS Oklahoma on December 7th, 1941. He'd only been there for 2 weeks. This is Pearl Harbor, of course. This is Randy Walsh from Hudson Falls, New York. How old do you think he was?
17.
He was 17 years old. He lied to get in about his age, and he was killed.
He's in the 1942 yearbook here.
And if you want to check the archives of the library, or Mr. Allen, or in the main office, you can find the 1942 Hudson Falls High School yearbook. You'll see his picture, 1942. Well, he was killed in 1941. He lied about his age, got out of high school early, and didn't really have much of a chance, did he? Okay, well, we're going to take a break. World War II Living History Project. We're broadcasting live on the World Wide Web. On my left, we have four gentlemen who served in the United States Navy. We have Mr. Barney Ross, who's at Pearl Harbor. You heard his story earlier. We have Mr. Gene Fellers. We also have Judge John Leary, who's seated over here, and Charlie Jones, who I forgot to mention the first time around. To my right, I have Mr. Walt Hammer, who was at Iwo Jima in Okinawa. These are all combat Marines. Mr. James Butterfield, who was blinded on Okinawa 56 years ago this month. We have Mr. Daniel Lawler, who was at Peleliu and also Okinawa. And they have stories to share as well. I have Mr. Art Laporte, who was wounded at Iwo Jima. And also I have Mr. Robert Addison, who was a member of the legendary Marines Addison's Raiders. He and Jerry West from Fort Edward came and told us they were the first ones in to actually fight the Japanese on land, and they went through hell at Guadalcanal. They were supported by the U.S. Navy personnel over on my left-hand side. And I just want to mention that Bob Addison has a copy of a book written by Joe Alexander, and it's called Addison's Rangers. It's the official history. I've read it. It's excellent, and the library has a copy of it too.
Raiders, not Rangers.
Did I say Rangers? Yeah. I meant to say Raiders, not Rangers. These are Marines. Okay, now I'm going to start the third half of our presentation. We'll go for probably till about 2:15, and we'll take questions from the audience for any of the men up here. This segment, we're getting closer towards the end of the war. Japan knows, as the Marines take island after island, that if the Marines and the Navy, etc., and the Army can fly in and bomb the Japanese mainland and get back to a base and get refueled, then the war is going to be over for them. So they're fighting tooth and nail. Judge, would you like to lead?
Yes, I'd like to get do I have your permission?
You may be excused. Thank you very much for coming. Can we have a hand for the judge, please?
Thank you. Thank you, man, for having me.
Hey, that was permission to abandon ship.
Huh?
Permission
That
to
was one of
abandon
the
ship?
first things I learned.
You want to be piped off? You want to be piped off?
That was a dirty look.
You're leaving.
Yeah, they blast your ears off, and then they ask you if you can hear this.
Now hear this. We got an American hero leaving the room, people. So let's have another hand for him. Okay, we're going to start the next half of our presentation talking about the end of the war and the desperation that the Japanese feel. This is the phase that you've probably heard about, the kamikaze pilots. Here's a PowerPoint presentation by Ben Smith, one of my students, and Jessica Sherlock's going to be at the helm again. Go ahead, Jeff. It's absolutely out of the question for you to remain alive. Your mission involves certain death, the divine win. Kamikaze by Ben Smith. A kamikaze pilot writes his last letter home. I leave for the attack with a smile on my face. I will show you that I know how to die with bravery. It was the code of Bushido, the code of the warrior, the code of the samurai. They were going to die for their emperor, for their homeland. Kamikaze pilot. Leyte Gulf was where kamikaze tactics were first used. The suicide pilots at Lingayen Gulf sunk 4 Allied vessels and damaged another 43. The beginning of the kamikaze. Reasons for the suicide pilots? The Japanese were running short on pilots and planes. Most of the trained pilots had been killed. It's 1944 now. So new alternates had to be found, alternatives. The idea of suicide pilots was well suited to the desperate situation and the code of a warrior. The reasons for the suicide pilots continued. Young men were trained to fly old obsolete planes that were packed with explosives. They were trained only how to take off and fly, not how to land. Some suicide pilots were actually welded into the cockpit so they could not escape. They weren't forced against their will. They just feared chickening out, so to speak, once the moment was upon them. So they had no choice. This is their wish. They would then fly their planes into American ships. Kamikazes at Iwo Jima sunk an escort carrier and damaged five others. 2 of these 5 ships were aircraft carriers that were attacked. And this was Iwo, 8 square miles of unadulterated hell. I recently received a package from a Marine who was privileged enough to walk the beaches of Iwo Jima, which is back in the control of the Japanese. And he sent me packages saying, which I have down in my room, I'm afraid. I didn't bring it, but you can tell it's Iwo because it's black sand. It was a sulfuric volcano that they landed on, these Marines over here. And this is, the Navy had to deal with the kamikazes as they were supporting these Marines. Next slide. Okinawa was the most fierce display of kamikazes during the war, and Gene's going to mention something about that in a minute. The American forces were closing in on the homeland, the Japanese homeland. 30 U.S. ships were sunk and 368 were damaged. And this, of course, was Okinawa, the last major battle and the largest land battle in the Pacific, if not the whole war. Okay. It's my privilege to introduce Mr. Gene Fellers. Gene's a retired teacher from Queensbury who was a radio technician. And Gene liked to come up here and speak because this is what we teachers like to do.
First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Roselle for his kind invitation, and acknowledge also another of your teachers, Denise, whom I've known since he was this big. I'm very happy to be here to tell you this story of the last great battle of the war, and the suicide planes play a big role in it, as your teacher has told you. And I have, for starters, I have a statement here from Admiral Morrison's book. He was the naval historian, he's a great historian, written many, many books concerning the sea. And he said this: although your historian himself has been under kamikaze attack and witnessed the hideous forms of death and torture inflicted by that weapon, words fail him to do justice to the sailors who met it so courageously. Men on radar picket station to survive not only had to strike down the flaming terror of the kamikazes, they were under constant strain and intense discomfort. For days and even nights on end, the crew had to stand to general quarters. Men had to keep in readiness for the instant reaction and split timing to riddle a plane bent on sacrificial death. The capture of Okinawa cost the U.S. Navy 4,900 men and over 4,800 wounded. The Marines and the Army on shore had also very heavy casualties. This was not an easy battle. It was a tough one. These killed and wounded were from 34 ships sunk and 368 ships damaged, many of them beyond repair. Now keep in mind, these kamikazes began this in the Philippines in February and March, and our ship didn't arrive over there until about the end of April. Okinawa was invaded in the 1st of April, and it looked like it was going to be a piece of cake. The Japanese strategy was to let our men land, and then let them advance beyond the range of the battleships who were out there supporting, and then they would strike. That was their strategy. So when we talk about Okinawa, we're talking about the defense or offense, really offensive program. We had 30 miles out a string of ships around the island. I think the island's about 100 miles long, but I've forgotten now just how long it is. Very rugged island, lots of coves and that sort of thing. 100 miles out, we had ships out there to warn of the approach of these kamikazes, and that was called the radar picket line. And ships that were sent out there found themselves sometimes 100 miles out, all by themselves out there. And if the kamikazes came in any numbers, it was almost certain that that ship would get hit, because the kamikazes might come at them from different directions all at the same time. Now, if you're dealing with a single one, that's one thing. But when they're coming from different directions, that's a totally different thing. And some of the big guns, of course, were useless. You talk about these battleships with 16-inch guns or 14-inch guns. Does that mean anything to you? That means the shell is about that big around, about yay long. The cruisers, like a friend here was on, they had 8-inch guns. That's a big shell too. But these guns are not equipped for this kind of fighting. And indeed, the Navy wasn't prepared for this at all. I mean, we never thought that any nation would send out its men to a certain death. I suppose if the United States were down on its knees, hard for me to imagine, that there would be some very heroic things done to save our country. But I can't quite imagine American men being asked to commit suicide. And that's what the Japanese asked. And it made for a lot of excitement, to put it lightly, a lot of excitement. Now, to begin at the beginning, I'll very briefly tell you that I went into the Navy. I was a college boy at the time, and I was offered a free flying course. And I got my license as a flyer, and then that's really all I could think about. I lost interest in philosophy and history and all the things in my classes, and I really wanted to go into the Navy and fly, as the judge did. But it didn't work out that way. I went down to the Air Force, the Army at that time, and I didn't pass the physical. I had strained my eyes, and I had high blood pressure, which I still have today. And I was amazed that they turned me down. They couldn't care less that I could fly an airplane. They really wished that I couldn't, because I would have to unlearn a lot of bad habits. So I thought, well, now what am I going to do now? I've dropped out of college. I don't want to go into the steel mill. And at that time, the Life magazine came out dedicated to the U.S. Navy. And all these interesting ports of call, you know, and all these pretty girls, and sailors were supposed to have a girl in every port. And I thought, this is an interesting life. This is what I think I want. Well, anyhow, I lost my father at an early age. I didn't know how to do anything practical. I didn't know how to fix the screen door. I didn't know how to drive the nail even. And I thought, well, I could learn a trade in there. I could actually do something with my life. And so I signed up. But the usual 4-year enlistment had been changed to 6 years. That made me hesitate. 6 years that's quite a long time. 6 years. I was 21 at that time. No, well, I told my mother, I'll go in there and I'll just stay in the Navy for 20 years, and I'll have my retirement. Not a very practical idea at all, but that's what I talked myself into. I went to Cleveland, Ohio, held up my hand, and I was in. Down to Norfolk, Virginia, picking up cigarette butts around the barracks at 6 o'clock in the morning with a fence about 12 feet high with barbed wire on it. I thought, my God, this is a prison. Well, what the hell am I doing here? After 6 weeks of that, we went through boot camp, and of course these Marines here can tell you real stories about boot camp. Well, what it's really like. It was a gentleman's game in the Navy compared to what they went through. So I picked radio school, and they sent me to Jacksonville, Florida. This is aviation radio, and we spent a very hot summer. I hated Florida. No fans, no air conditioning in those days. And all these barracks are built alike, no matter whether it's in Minnesota or Florida. Little windows, no air, no ventilation, no nothing. You're sitting in there with 40 guys taking the code. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I still know the code to this day. Well, I thought, well, I'll be assigned now to a squadron, because we were radio gunners. You see, we were supposed to fly backwards in the seat and fight them off if we were attacked from the rear. And that was my idea of what I was going to be doing. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Or should I say, fortunately, it didn't work. And they took 7 of us, right off the top of the class, sent us down to the main station, where they were building a tower. And they had a transmitter station 5 miles out in the swamp. And sent some of you up to Canada to find out about it. Now, I was a 3rd class radio operator, and I knew almost nothing about what makes a radio work. Oh, they showed us the bottom, said that's a condenser, and that's a resistor, and this is a coil. Yeah, well, it didn't really amount to anything. And so we were sent up there, went to New York, transferred, took a train to Clinton, Ontario, went to school, surrounded with barbed wire. You had to lock up your notebooks in the safe every night, and you were not to talk about this to anybody off of this base. Radar. Saving England over there, So what we saw was it had a little tube about that big, and you could see the water tank in Clinton on that tube. And when we went on Liberty, the girls in Clinton were very cute. And they're very friendly. And they used to tease us a bit. And they'd say, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, we're studying radio." They said, "You mean radar, don't you?" And I thought, oh, she's not supposed to know that word. And she says, "Don't worry, we know what it is, we know what it can do." And that's that. So it was it turned out the Japanese and the Germans both had some radar eventually. We just had more of it and better of it. So back I go to Florida, and that was a curse, because now I could not get out of the state I hated most. The heat, the bugs, the humidity, that's what I can't take. Even today I hate that place. I go down there almost every winter, and it's not too bad in the middle of winter. But the summers in those days were really hell. So I just could not get out of that. And they told me, no, you can't leave because we have something coming in for you. And when it came in, it was an Army radar station. It had an antenna longer than this room here, mounted on a building, and it could search for planes. They've trained fighter pilots to go up and gave them information to find incoming enemies' planes and shoot them down. This is what's saved England with this thing, and that's what it was all about. But my God, what I had seen in Canada, just little bitsy stuff, and this stuff, I had no idea. It had a tube that big. I had no idea what made it work. So when the Army installed it, and they turned it over to me. What a joke. And my assistant, Moon Mullins, who, by the way, got drunk one night and got married, and I said, Moon, come on, we got to get a truck and get down to the transmitter station. And he was holding his head, and he said, oh, my God. He stuttered as well. He says, the trouble is, I got married last night. I said, Moon, you don't have a girlfriend, do you? Well, there were girls who would actually marry 3-4 sailors. There's $10,000 insurance policy there. If they get killed, they could collect. And maybe no one would ever be the wiser that you married 3 or 4 of them. So this is what he ran into. Well, we went down and started up the diesel engines. Moon was my energy man, and they had generators on there that supplied the power. And I went in and I boldly turned on some switches to this thing, and it went vroom, and the smoke came rolling out of it. And I said, Moon, shut her down, shut her down. And he pulled all those big switches and shut down all these engines, and we called the Army, and they came and fixed it. And I said, well, now, you know, if I ever get a chance to study radar, radar, I'm sick of this. I'm going to jump at it. And sure enough, shortly after that, I got a chance to go to radar school to Chicago. And this was in 43. We had, I took 2 years of high school algebra in 6 weeks. We had lots of math and that sort of thing. And then we went to primary school in downtown Chicago, up 5 floors. And then we went from there, we built our own radio receiver. From there we went to Treasure Island, California, in San Francisco Bay, and we studied all the major radars and the underwater sound equipment and all that stuff. And when we graduated from there, we were pronounced technicians. And I was assigned the first ship on the list. And I should have been suspicious because it had a strange number. It said APA 70. Well, the APA is a troop ship. And that's pretty nice duty on that because you take the troops over and then you come back to San Francisco, have a good time, and then take another load over. But I didn't get an APD. They made a mistake. And it turned out to be APD. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means it's a destroyer, the D for destroyer, which is a small ship, and the P is for personnel, and the A is for auxiliary. So this is something new. We never heard of a ship like this. Well, the strategy was in the Pacific that many of the Japanese were holed up on islands around the Philippines, especially, and south of there. And these islands, these people on these islands were starving. And so this ship was designed to bombard the island and send in troops on what they called Higgins boats, which you've seen pictures of those boats where the ramp goes down in the front, and they go ashore, and these men know about that. And we had they put 4 of them on there. And here's my painting of the Republic, right here. This is what an APD looked like. It looks like a tramp steamer. Really, it doesn't look like a fighting ship. There's one 5-inch gun on there. Now, a destroyer escort would have 3 5-inch guns, but they took 2 of them off. And this funny thing here in the middle of the ship is a davit to lower those 4 boats, 2 on each side, to lower them into the water. Well, where's the firepower? Well, we ain't got. They sacrificed it. You got 1 5-inch gun. You got 3 twin 20s. 3 twin 40s, 40 millimeter. So this ship is a hybrid. I was terribly disappointed when I arrived down in Orange, Texas, where they built it. And I said, well, where's my ship? And they pointed to a rusty hull over there. This was in October. And it took them 3 months to build it. And a lot of it was done by lady welders. And you know, they're good welders. We were in a typhoon off of Okinawa, and we did, with all the top weight on that ship, we did a 54-degree roll. Now, that would be a 45-degree roll. Now go on 9 more degrees, and you can see how close we were to capsizing with all that weight up there. But she did it. We thought of those lady welders. They were good. They also had pretty girls on there doing electrical work. But if they spoke to us, they could be fired for even speaking to us. Young people being young. What else? You know, we thought we could have a little fun and a few jokes and whatnot. But no, they were not allowed to do it. They risked their job. So after 3 months of that, away we go down the Sabine River, down to the Gulf of Mexico. It was like going through a field because it was like a canal, and all these rice fields and which I didn't see from where I was standing. And it just looked like we were traveling in the country. We get down there. Now, much of this crew was green. I'd never been to sea before, and most of these guys never had. And some of them really didn't know their job very well, because the main bearing that drives a huge round shaft about that size out to drive the propeller has to be oiled. And if the oil gets too low, the siren goes off. And it went off. And they all stood and looked at each other down there. A couple of them had experience. I don't know why they couldn't find the valve, but burn out the main bearing, and this is the first day out. Our captain was fit to be tied. He was in his cabin chewing on the rug. He wanted to make advancements as everybody did in the Navy, and this is no way to make this impression. There's no way to do it. So back we go into Galveston, and they have put in a new main shaft. And from there we go down Florida, Cuba, out in the Atlantic, out to Bermuda, and do what they call a shakedown cruise. And on that cruise, you learn how the guns fire. You learn how to take on oil from a tanker at sea, and they spilled it. Wouldn't you know, it went down my compartment. For the rest, for at least half of that cruise, I'm sleeping in a compartment that smells like oil. I was glad to move out of there. We chased a captured Italian submarine for practice, and fired the guns and one thing and another for a month. And every morning they'd say, set the special sea detail. And I think that's when my seasickness began, with those words. Because 30 days I was sick every single day. A big breakfast, a few crackers at noon, and then back in and tie up. And after a couple of hours, you begin feeling fairly normal. What do you got for supper? So, oh, pork chops. Well, I'll give them a try. Oh, up we go and have a try. And 30 days I did that. 30 days vomiting over the side. So we went then to Norfolk and we trained with the Marines for landings. And then from there we went down to Panama Canal and went through. And from there we went up to San Diego, and there we worked with the Marines again with landings. Then off to Hawaii, and there we did exercises at Maui. You guys remember Maui? Go over there and do a couple bursts with machine guns, and you're qualified, right? So away we go then. From there, we go to the South Pacific. Well, not below the equator, just close to it, to Majuro, right close to the south of the Philippines. Here's where the Philippines. Here we are. Here's the Philippines, and it began here, right in this area. There was a little, atoll there. You know, you have these little islands, if you want to call them islands, but they're very small. And every sailor was handed 2 cans of beer, which had been sealed in a compartment by welders and opened only on great occasions. And so we each got 2 cans of beer. And that island had thousands of sailors over there from all these ships, all kinds of ships in that anchorage. The ground over there was a little soggy, and it hadn't rained. You can figure out why it's soggy. Well, anyhow, back on the ship, and now we're going to go to Okinawa. Okay, now these little ships could do anything a destroyer could do except fight. Now, we had depth charges, we had the underwater sound gear, we had surface radar, we had air radar, but we had no radar control on that one 5-inch gun. The other sets of guns that mount anything were 40 millimeters. That shell is about that big around and about that long. And it's excellent for what we had to do against these kamikazes. A 20 millimeter is much too small. If they're coming at you at 400 miles an hour, it's almost dark, and he's coming down at you in a dive. You might hit him with a 40. A 40 you can hit him. With a 20 is too late. You might hit him, but he's still coming. He's on fire, but he's still coming. He's got a 500-pound bomb on the underside of that plane. Pardon me?
On behalf of Ms. Circolini and Mrs. Miller, I'd like to announce the court for the class of 2002.